Good evening, Zimbabwe. This is Lynn. Welcome to your weekly business show, BH24 Business Around the Clock. I am here with Kutsi. Hi, Kutsi.
Hey, how are you doing?
I am very well, thank you. This week, we're having an extremely interesting topic. And in studio today, we have Mr. Christian Beddies. He is the resident representative of the IMF. How are you doing, Mr. Christian?
I'm very well, thank you. I wanted to thank you for the invitation and giving me this opportunity to talk to you tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for coming through. We're excited to have you and to get into our discussions for tonight. Kutsi, why don't you take us out?
Okay, no problem. It's an interesting topic as well. We've been covering the IMF for the past 2 weeks now. And, I think we go back to basics, for the ordinary folk out there. Okay, what does it mean that Zimbabwe has met when you talk about the quantitative targets and structural benchmarks under the IMF's SMP program?
Well, thank you very much for this question. This is, in fact, an interesting question. And for the benefit of your audience, let me go back a little bit and explain what the recent visit by the IMF team was actually all about.
Yeah.
The mission, as you know, was led by Mr. Domenico Fanizza and visited Harare from September 17th to October 1. So they left today to conduct the third review under the SMP and also to hold discussions on a potential successor arrangement.
Yeah.
Now, because the government of Zimbabwe met all the end June 2014 quantitative targets and structural benchmarks, which you were referring to in your question, under this SMP, we are now in a position to propose to our management in Washington the completion of this third and final review. So in a nutshell, the government of Zimbabwe successfully completed this SMP. It also, and that is also very important, paved the way for negotiations on a new SMP.
Okay.
Because if we had problems with the previous ones, with the implementation, it would be very difficult to think of a new one. So we're very pleased that this all worked out.
Yeah.
As people may know from the recent joint press conference with the Minister of Finance and Economic Development, Shinamasa, and Mr. Fanisa, these negotiations were also completed successfully, and we reached a staff-level agreement. Now, what does staff-level agreement mean?
Yeah.
All agreements we reach in the field, the staff of the IMF, are still subject to approval by our management.
Okay.
So, again, we are now in a position to propose to our management the approval of this SMP, this new SMP.
Okay. So basically, Zimbabwe has met all the targets and benchmarks that had been set from the original SMP.
Yes.
And then that allows, if they want to negotiate for another SMP.
For the next 15
that
months.
allows
15,
to complete this review for which these measures were relevant, the structural benchmarks and quantitative targets. But it also, having a good track record of implementation is kind of a precondition or prerequisite to think of new programs.
Okay,
right?
so from Washington, they then have to make a decision that,
No, I mean, we made the assessment here that they met these conditions.
Okay.
We negotiated, of course, for a new SMP, you also, the government and the staff, we also have to agree on this program, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I will get later to more of the details of that program, but as I said, the negotiations were successful, and we will now propose, as soon as the mission gets back to Washington, as I said, they left today, earlier in the day, we will write a report, finalize the report, which will propose to management completion of the review and a new 15-month SMP.
I see.
That is really interesting. But I'm sure most people are always thinking about the debt that the country has. I mean, they think, okay, fine, we did these, we finished, we met the targets, but Zim has this debt. And we know that it's amounting to at least 10 billion. How much of this debt must it clear before it can start accessing new loans, especially in respect to the IMF?
Well, you're touching on a really, really important issue. I mean, the debt issue is on everybody's mind here in Zimbabwe, in the international community. So this is truly an important issue. Now, let me first clarify, since you mentioned a number, 10 billion, which types of debt are relevant here. And what we are looking at with the government of Zimbabwe is basically public and publicly guaranteed debt.
Okay.
That is debt that has been contracted by the public sector, or guaranteed by the public sector.
Okay.
Now, there's no issue with private sector debt for these purposes. Now, for those of you, and I hope I'm not getting into too much detail, who are not familiar with that definition of what is the public sector, let me just briefly explain it to you. This comprises basically the general government and all state-owned enterprises, with the general government again being the central government, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe,
As well, yeah.
and extra budgetary funds, social security, and local government. So we're looking at debts by any of these entities that comprise the public sector.
Okay.
Now, so defined, the total public and publicly guaranteed debt at end 2013 amounted to about, say, $7 billion.
Okay.
Right? So not the 10. Of which, and here comes the problematic part, about 5.5 are in arrears.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Yeah.
And the World Bank being the largest multilateral creditor with about 1 billion in arrears. So that's clearly something, we need to work on a strategy, on a plan. How do we address this issue?
Okay.
Now, the access to new loans from the IMF requires several steps.
Mm-hmm.
We need to address the arrears situation, as I mentioned. That's sort of a precondition.
Yeah.
And in order to reschedule Zimbabwe's bilateral debt and address these arrears, we need a fund financial arrangement.
Okay.
This is a requirement by the Paris Club, which reschedules bilateral debt.
Okay.
But that, in turn, requires the clearance of arrears to the IMF, which we believe is doable, but also a credible plan of how to address the arrears with multilateral institutions. The fund,
Yeah.
the IMF cannot lend into arrears
Okay.
with multilateral
So
institutions.
there has to be some plan in place, and
It has to be approved.
The good thing is,
well, yeah.
while the arrears to the IMF will have to be cleared before an arrangement can start, for the others, for the multilaterals, a credible plan needs to exist. It doesn't mean that on day one or upon before approval, all this has to be repaid. But
Okay.
there has to be a plan in place, and obviously the creditors, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, have
Those
to be
are-
okay with that plan.
I
So
see.
that
I see.
that is really, really important.
Okay.
And this is also the more complicated part, obviously, and the amounts are not small. So the government, and we have discussed this over the last 2 weeks during the mission, will need to make a concerted effort to reach out to these multilateral institutions
Whom they owe money.
whom they owe money to and its largest shareholders to garner support for a comprehensive arrears clearance strategy
I see.
or plan.
What are the chances of all the creditors approving on the plans?
Well, look, this is a process, and we are at the beginning of the road, right? And I was just going to say, the upcoming annual meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in Washington end of next week, which the government, the authorities, the central bank will be attending, provides really a golden opportunity to get this process started. This is the place where everybody in the financial world gets together, twice a year for the annual meetings and the spring meetings. And this is the place where the officials of Zimbabwe have an opportunity to engage in talks with the key people.
Okay.
And this is, as I said, I think this is really a golden opportunity that, this happens very soon to get the process started,
So our government should really get the ball rolling now.
Definitely.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, I have to say, sort of subject to approval by our
Yes.
management. We just finished the staff level negotiations, right, successfully.
Yeah.
We will obviously do everything we can to
Yeah.
help. I mean, the SMP is sort of a testament to that,
Yes.
that we managed to get this program. Although I wanted to say this later, but I want to say it actually now in this context.
Yeah.
The SMP is truly the authorities' program, and the Minister of Finance and Economic Development, Shinamasa, has said it many times publicly and with us that this is Zimbabwe's SMP.
Yeah.
This is not the IMF's program.
Yeah.
And, we'll get to that later, but this is really a key thing
Yeah.
because it suggests ownership.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
And programs that have a high level of ownership have the best
Success.
chances for success.
I see.
It is
Yeah.
the government who believes that these reforms are necessary.
Yeah.
Of course, we agree with them.
Yes.
I mean, as we have said, but the government truly believes in them,
Yeah.
and that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. Yeah. So taking ownership that this is our SMP.
Yes.
Give you that pride.
Yeah. Nice. Visiting IMF head of delegation, Sir Domenico Fanita, recently said that the IMF was working in conjunction with the government to see the success of Zim Asset. What would you say are the key components of Zim Assets that make it a policy which has the potential to revive Zimbabwe's economy?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I believe that the government's efforts in putting together Zim Asset, the Zimbabwe Agenda for Sustainable Socio-Economic Transformation, have been commendable in my view.
Yeah.
It is an ambitious development strategy that addresses many of Zimbabwe's economic challenges.
Yes.
As you know, it's a cluster-based approach with different clusters, like, for example, food security, social services, infrastructure, and adding value to the economy.
Yes.
And some subclusters that go into the area of, for example, fiscal reform.
Yes,
right?
of course, yeah.
That sort of helps to implement the strategy with a coordinated approach, which is obviously very important. Now, so you can see all these areas are key issues that need to be tackled eventually, not all at the same time,
Of course, yeah.
to revive Zimbabwe's economy. Now, from what the IMF does, we are not experts in specific sector work.
Of course,
but what we do best, I believe, is looking at the macroeconomic situation, public finances, monetary, fiscal policy, these kind of things. And one of the objectives of Zim Asset is also putting public finances on a sound footing.
Yes.
Goal of the subcluster on fiscal.
Yes.
And that will help to increase Zimbabwe's capacity to repay, which sends again a good signal to the creditors, that want their money back. That the country is actually working on increasing its capacity to repay.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody understands and acknowledges that Zimbabwe cannot repay this, in the next month. Or
Yeah,
in the
of
next
course. Yeah. It's
2
going to
months.
take time. Yeah.
We need a plan for that. Right?
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say on Zim Asset is that, which I think is a good thing, is that the government has also stepped up its efforts to reach out to a broader set of stakeholders. As you may know, I'm sure you do know, in September, the authorities held a workshop, I think it was in Nyanga,
Yes.
inviting basically the donor community, private sector representatives, NGOs, and the idea was to, prioritize the economic blueprint for the next 5 years, Zim Asset.
Yeah.
And this is very important, I think, because, for a very simple reason, working together as a team, say, has the highest chances for success. And also prioritizing a really broad development strategy is important because you can't do everything all at once.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And finally, what I want to say on this issue is, of course, that said, it's also clear that Zimbabwe will need financing and capital flows to realize Zim Asset. This is why, or what we are working on together with the new SMP, being a step in that direction. And as I said, it's the government's SMP.
Okay.
All right. Well, I guess our final question for tonight, and one I'm sure you won't be really happy to hear, but I must ask. In April this year, Ukraine got a 17 billion loan from IMF, approved by the institution's executive board. Would you say that Zimbabwe's situation is much worse than that of Ukraine, that the IMF would say it will not extend Zimbabwe any new loans until it clears its arrears?
Okay, well, that's a fair question. Let me start the following way. I think these are two very different issues. One, the approval by the IMF executive board of a loan for Ukraine, and the fact that Zimbabwe does currently not have access to fund financing.
I see.
The reason why Zimbabwe cannot access fund financial support at this time is